Well, I think we can get started. Welcome everybody to the SFA and University of Minnesota Extension Asparagus webinar. Just a little bit of background on this project. We are close to a year and a half into the project. The goal is to increase the production of premium asparagus and the marketing of it. And we're doing that in a number of ways, including doing webinars and workshops and field days to teach folks about asparagus production. And then we are also working with the Regional Sustainable Development Partnership, which is an arm of U of M Extension, to build out the supply chain and to do the piece on marketing. And we're actually just starting that work, and we are hopefully going to get another couple of years of funding to be able to continue the project. But even if we don't, we're pretty pleased with the amount of participation among growers. I'm very happy to have the growers who are part of our stipend project on this call as well. And I appreciate those who applied, who we were not able to choose. In the event that we get additional funding, you'll be on the list to be eligible. So I'd like to introduce our speakers and other folks that are critical to this project. Connie Karsten, some of you know, many of you have had contact with her in applying for the stipend. Connie is from Litchfield, Hutchinson, between Litchfield and Hutchinson, and she runs the sheep shop. I believe I have that, or is it the sheep shed? Regardless, Annie Claude is our lead trainer today. She is an extension educator, and she heads up the work dealing with fruits as well as perennials. And asparagus being a perennial is one reason why Annie's on this project. And then Paul Schmidt of Schmidt Farms down in Preston is a grower who has about an acre of asparagus. And Paul will also be part of the training team today. And then another person who is joining the training team, says Annie Claude by her name. She's the person with dark hair who has Annie Claude by her name, and that is Natalie Hoydal. And Natalie will be assisting in teaching some additional asparagus webinars and workshops. A couple housekeeping items. I would say at this juncture, if you don't have your computer on mute, please put it on. And I would say, if it's okay with Annie and Paul, ask questions throughout, and we'll certainly have discussion time at the end. We want to wrap this up by 10:15. It's 75 minutes. So I think without any more discussion, Annie, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. First, Teresa, I think from your screen, you are able to mute all participants. Could you go ahead and try to do that? Because the background noise is going to be pretty distracting. If you scroll down by people's names, there should be a little icon that'll. All right, that's a lot better. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then so when Paul talks, and Paul will chime in whenever he wants. That's kind of how we do this, is Paul and I are both kind of giving the presentation together. And especially during the Q&A, Paul will definitely be talking then. So he'll unmute his mic, but if everybody else could keep muted, that'll just help us prevent all the background noise. All right. So this is a presentation that Paul and I have given a number of times at various conferences and throughout the SFA Asparagus project in a couple webinars and a couple meetings such as at Fond du Lac and at SFA chapter meetings. So we tweak it a little bit every time. And so I've kind of catered this presentation to the group that's here today because a lot of you have already bought your asparagus to be planted for this season. So for instance, we've taken out a bunch of the slides about how to choose varieties, and we're able to then focus that time on other things, which is exciting. So we did a lot in 2009 of as far as teaching people about asparagus and gathering their ideas about asparagus as well. And so we went to a lot of places. We were at a few SFA chapter meetings. We were at Hoffa learning together. We were at the Fond du Lac Reservation, Doubting Thomas Farms, Chengwatana Farm, Big River Farms, and yeah, so we were kind of all over the place. One of the things that we did that was fun in the pictures to the left and to the right there with Jansen at Hoffa and Paul, is we spent a lot of time at Hoffa leading the planting demonstrations and then following up later in the season to see the asparagus stands after they were planted. And so that was really cool seeing how, different growers approach growing asparagus. So today we're going to talk about why you would grow asparagus and a little about how asparagus actually grows, because I'm a firm believer in knowing a little bit about the plant that you're growing helps us manage it. We'll talk about choosing a site for asparagus for those who may be debating where to plant your asparagus. We'll talk about planting itself and then some organic management tips. And during the second half, we'll leave that for Q&A. So hopefully we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes for that. Any questions you have, marketing, caring for established stands, harvesting, anything else, write down your questions during the talk if you want to save them for the Q&A portion. But as Teresa said, you're welcome to ask questions via the chat box at any time. Why grow asparagus? Well, for one, it's a perennial crop. The stands can last up to 15 years or sometimes more. So this is great. This is a crop that we don't have to go in and till the soil every year. Little or no tillage is required because it's a perennial. It leaves a lot of opportunities for cover cropping and for pollinator planting. So those are a couple of reasons we're really excited about this. So it has a lot of benefits for soil health, and it can really help us rejuvenate soil that maybe has been tilled multiple times every year for a long time and build up that soil health again. It's an early season crop, and in the Twin Cities, it's averaging about $5 a pound, or in other words, $5 per bunch, which is how it's often sold. It performs in diverse soil types, which is great. We never want to necessarily plant something in a super heavy clay soil, but compared to some other vegetable crops, it does better in a wider range of soils. This is good. This is good. And it can grow well organically in Minnesota. And there are a number of organic farms that we can use as examples that are growing asparagus successfully in our state. These are the crowns. So it's my understanding that everyone or almost everyone on this call has already purchased your crowns from one of the nurseries. These are what the crowns will look like when they come in. The man in the top photo is holding an individual crown. That's a very healthy looking one. Some of them are a little bit smaller than that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But the picture on the bottom, that's what they look like in the bunches. I think they're bunches of 25 or so. The crowns are what we actually plant, and these grow really quickly after planting. So within a couple of weeks, you'll see them sprouting out of the ground. It's important to note that while these root systems grow really, really far out from the plant, they can go out to, 6 feet or so. The most absorbative roots, the ones that are actually taking up the nutrients, those are limited to about the top 6 to 12 inches of the soil, or in other words, where you place the crown. We'll talk about that later. So what this means is it's really important to have good nutrition for those plants in the shallow part of the soil, because that's where they're taking up the nutrients. This also means that those roots are competing with weeds, and if we have cover crops that kind of encroach into the row on a newly planted stand, those weeds and cover crops are going to compete with the newly planted asparagus. Once asparagus becomes more mature and established, this is less of an effect, but especially for newly planted stands, it's really important to make sure that there aren't any other plants in that row that are competing with the asparagus. Here's a snapshot of how asparagus grows in the first year. The crowns are planted sometime in May. Sometimes in certain parts of Minnesota, of course, it's necessary to plant them in early June. But we don't want to go past the middle of June when planting asparagus, even in the colder parts of our state, because the shorter season the crowns have to establish, the slower they're going to be to mature the following season. So it's important to try to get those in the spring. 3 to 4 weeks after planting, you'll start to see those spears sprout up. They'll be very small spears, very skinny. They won't look like the spears that you purchase at the farmer's market or the grocery store. They'll be very small. By July, you should start seeing those spears turn into ferns. And so this picture in the lower left is an asparagus patch at Big River Farms. So that's near Stillwater. And this is what their patch looked like in July. So about maybe 6 weeks or so after planting, maybe more like 8 weeks. I don't remember exactly the date that they planted, but it was sometime in late May or early June. And then by October, this is a picture of, on the lower right, of a beautiful asparagus patch that we saw at Hoffa that seemed to have been managed really well. Weed control was a major focus for this farmer. And so you can see the effects of really good weed control. The stand was very healthy. She had a lot of spears coming up off of each plant. We were really happy to see that. Here's what a couple of asparagus plantings look like in Minnesota. This is the same photo you saw on the lower left on the slide before of a newly planted field, but this is a mature field in Northfield at Open Hands Farm that I took July 24th of 2019. And this asparagus patch has been growing for multiple years. And so you can kind of see the difference in how it matures over time. These rows have really grown into each other. So that kind of emphasizes the importance of planting your rows far enough apart to keep in mind that they will grow together quite a bit over time. In mature years, this is a snapshot of how asparagus grows. You're probably familiar with this, but just as a, kind of a refresher, this is what the spears look like when they're first coming up in the spring. So this is typically late April or early May, depending on our season. And harvest season runs from May to June, so it's usually about 6 weeks or so. And this is from Paul Schmidt's farm. This is a picture of one of his asparagus rows. So you can see over time, once they mature, you've got quite a few spears coming up all at once. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about allocating labor to harvesting asparagus. You've got quite a bit coming up. And then this is an asparagus patch post-harvest. We took this picture in October when we were out at Hoffa visiting their asparagus patches. This is a mature one, so it was not established as part of the project. It was established, I think, 5 years ago, if I remember correctly. So you can see those ferns that grow up after the harvest season is over. They can grow quite tall. It's really important to let those ferns grow tall without interrupting their growth, because the taller and healthier they grow, the more reserves that they can put down in the soil to support next year's spears. So that's an important part of growing asparagus. In year 2, so that would be, a year after you plant, you might not harvest at all. Or if you decide to harvest, you may do a very small harvest of just a few spears. In year 3, you can do a slightly larger harvest. And then after year 4, that's when you're looking at your full harvest of asparagus, as long as the stand is healthy and productive. So I'm going to let Paul talk more about that. If Paul can unmute his mic right now, maybe he'll comment on that. If not, he can answer that during the Q&A. Paul, are you there?
Me.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Gotcha. Oh, I suppose Teresa had me muted too. Double mute. All right. Yeah, I would say, in what we're calling year 2 here, if you could avoid harvesting, I would avoid harvesting then. That would allow you to perhaps harvest in year 3, 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks. And it really depends on the health of the plant in year 1. If your plants all come up and they're maybe, say, I don't know, 10 inches tall, 12 inches tall, and then they fern out, and that's it, and that's all you get in year 1, you cannot harvest those year 2. I planted part of my patch late in July, which is not recommended, and those ferns were all about 10 or 12 inches tall. and we did not touch them the next year, and we had a pretty good stand. But it's not recommended, but it was a spring like last year where it was wet, 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 and we didn't have the opportunity to plant. So, I mean, just you really need to pay attention to the health of your plant. If you question whether or not you would be able to harvest, just ask. Ask one of us, ask somebody who's growing.
All right, thanks. I think if you leave yourself off of mute, I wasn't hearing any background noise with your phone, Paul, so maybe you could leave yourself off of mute and then you can interrupt me whenever you want. All right,
Yep.
so we'll move into sort of preparing to plant now. The first thing you have to do is choose your planting site, and maybe during the Q&A or something, you can type into the chat box. I'm curious to know if people have already chosen your site or if you have questions about what site, where you want to put your asparagus. One of the things you can do to help choose your site is do a soil test. We'll talk more about this in a couple of slides. This allows you to amend your soil if needed and really know and understand like the pH of your soil and what nutrients your soil already has so that you can do a better job of figuring out what nutrients you need to add. Maybe your site is already in a spot where you've been planting crops for a number of years. Maybe you've already taken soil tests in the last few years and you know your soil very well. Then maybe you don't need to do this to the extent that you would otherwise. It just really depends on your farm. But especially if you're planting on a site that you don't feel like you know too well, or maybe you haven't planted there before, it's really important to get to know your site. Decide which varieties you want to plant. Hopefully at this stage, everybody on this call has already done that, and calculate the number of plants needed. Typically on average, we're looking at 10,000 crowns per acre. It'll vary a little bit depending on your row spacing, but typically we're planting crowns at 1 foot apart, 12 inches. So you can calculate that on your own, but it's going to be somewhere about 10,000 plants per acre. All right. Evaluating a new site, again, this is something that's going to be important if you're planting on a site where you haven't been growing crops in the past. But if you have been growing crops there, just ask yourself, how well did other crops grow in this spot? And you can kind of compare that to asparagus and think about, well, how well might my asparagus grow here? If you have a lot of weeds, that's something to think about. If you don't have very high soil nutrition in that spot, that's something to think about. So you can do a soil test. If you're not familiar with the soil, or if it's a newly purchased property, one tool you can use, which is really interesting, and I don't know how many farmers in Minnesota have been using this tool, but it's a really handy one if you don't mind, sitting at your computer for a little bit trying to navigate the site and figure out how it works. It's called the NRCS Web Soil Survey, and this is the link for it. Here's the type of info that it spits out. So you can actually enter the GPS coordinates of your site, and it'll make your farm or your property show up on a map. And then you can actually make it so that it maps all of the different soil types within your farm. So in this picture, all of these orange outlines are outlining a different soil type or a different land use type. So you see here, there's this little red number and letter sequence, and here there's a code as well. So those are two different soil types. So it'll tell you like what's the relative sand, silt, loam content of the soil. It'll give you an idea of where the water table is in that soil. And so this can be a really cool tool for deciding where to plant asparagus, because you might learn surprising things about an area of your property. When you're choosing a site for asparagus, this is a perennial plant that can live over 15 years, like we said before. And so you can think like an orchardist or think like a vineyard manager when you're trying to figure out a place to put your asparagus. I say this because I spend a lot of my job working with fruit growers. And so these are some pictures that I've taken at vineyards that I work with. And you can see this picture on the left, which is a farm near Otsego. This is a very nice slope that they have their vineyard on. So the water that falls is going to drain nicely down that slope. It's not going to flood their crop. This picture on the left, not so great. This is at the bottom of a valley. The soybeans growing here are very happy. The grapes that are growing here have died multiple times because water pools in that area, especially in the spring and the fall, and the crop really doesn't like that. Grapes don't like pooling water, neither does asparagus. So you don't want to be planting a perennial crop, especially in an area where water frequently pools, because once you plant it there, you can't move it. It's just there. Make sure you've got access to irrigation, at least in year one. You know, depending on the season, irrigation might not be necessary, but it is good to have that option in case we have dry spells. Because if you're irrigating your crop, you're keeping it healthy in that first year, there's a better chance that it's going to establish well. As far as the soil type, as I said before, asparagus can survive on a number of soil types. It really likes sandy, sandy loam, and lower clay content soil. Heavier soil can work, but if you're growing on heavier soil, it's even more important that you're growing on a slope so that soil is well drained. Avoid foggy valleys and frost pockets as well, because those are areas where you can have more freeze injury. If you want to do a soil test, there are multiple places where you can get a soil test if you've never done one before, but one of them is the University of Minnesota Soil Testing Lab. There were rumors going around that it's closed due to COVID-19, but those rumors are not true. The soil testing lab is very much open. All you have to do is mail your soil sample into them. So this is the link here. Right now is a really good time to take a soil test as long as your soil is workable. I went out and did some soil sampling on Sunday, and it was lovely. The soil was a great condition to go ahead and do that. What you want, the top things at least that you want in a soil test are organic matter and pH, and then phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. A lot of soil tests will not test nitrate. They won't test nitrogen content for you. The basic reason for that is nitrate content in the soil is changing constantly. So if you take a soil sample one day and it says your nitrate content is this, the chances of that still being your nitrate content 5 days later are a little low, especially if it rains. And so we measure organic matter content instead, which is correlated to relative nitrogen content in the soil. Here's an example of a soil test report you would get back if you go through University of Minnesota. If you go through someone like Midwest Labs, it's going to look different, but this is just an example. So what I want to draw your attention to is this organic matter here. These are the and you can see that here it says organic matter. And so this is showing you that with just these two O's, right, low, medium, high on the scale, this farm had relatively low organic matter. In fact, it was only 1.1% organic matter. This is because this soil was taken from a loamy sand farm near North Branch, so extremely sandy soil. The phosphorus was found to be very high, and potassium levels were found to be high as well. And so now the question is, what do you do to interpret a soil test before you plant your asparagus? Okay, so let's look first and remember that this organic matter percent was about 1.1. All right. There are established recommendations for what to do for asparagus based on your soil tests. These are developed over a number of years studying asparagus by soil health experts and farmers. And so the recommendations say that for a new asparagus planting, if you have low organic matter, like he did, his organic matter was 1.1%, then for a new planting, you're going to want to apply 120 pounds per acre of nitrogen. And you might think, well, I apply compost or I apply manure. I don't know how much nitrogen is in that. We actually have resources to help you estimate how much nitrogen is in your organic amendment that you're putting on. You can also use granulated fertilizer, which has more of an established nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus content. But this is basically what it's saying. Basically, you want to add a lot of organic matter to your soil to get it to the point where it's going to be suitable for asparagus. Similarly with phosphorus, we've got recommendations for those too. And so in this case, his phosphorus levels were over 100. So if your phosphorus soil test says you're over 100 or over 41, in fact, then it's saying for a new asparagus patch, you want to put on at least 25 pounds per acre of phosphate. Again, even if you're using an organic-based amendment or fertilizer type, you can still estimate the phosphorus content in that. And so these are the guidelines for how much you would want to add. Here's some resources that we have developed at University of Minnesota that are helpful. One of them is called the U of M Nutrient Management Guide for Fruit and Vegetable Crops. We have one specifically for organic systems. So it talks a lot about estimating the nutrient content of your manure or compost or whatever you might be using. And then these tables are taken directly from the U of M Asparagus Production Guide, so you can find more information on that in those as well. All right, planting the crowns. What time is it? We're behind, of course, but I want to have Paul kind of comment on how you went about fertilizing your asparagus patch when you planted.
Yeah, during establishment, I think it's probably way more important to get that phosphate in there, the phosphorus, and I did it in kind of a non-recommended way. It was an established field, and I went in and dug my trenches right in there, and then we put triple superphosphate right in the bottom of the trench. But that was to get the phosphate level up there where it needed to be. We had low phosphorus levels on that portion of the field. And since then, it's been transitioned to organic. Triple superphosphate is not something you can use if you're organic, but you can find ways of getting that phosphorus up there. It's best if you can do it before and incorporate a large portion of the phosphorus, plus put some in the bottom of the trench. Now, if you're using straight manure, you want to watch it because some of that manure can be kind of hot and might burn or burn new root growth off the crowns and that type of thing. So I hesitate once you're established to put any manure on top, composted or otherwise, because it can be a source of E. coli's or just a source for fungal growth on top. And with a product like asparagus, where people eat it raw, sometimes we just can't chance that. Mm-hmm. So, but the main thing is, I think, get that phosphate out there, get some nitrogen out there. But I don't know, it was a little haphazard for me, and I still like using manure best. You just need to be careful that it's not too hot.
All right, thanks, Paul. Okay, let's get into planting the crowns. This is what you'll be doing pretty soon. This photo, since it's nice and close up here, I'll talk about it. This is a photo we took at Hoffa last May when we were doing an asparagus planting demonstration. So we had Paul put the crowns in the ground, and what you can see here is they are planted head to toe. You might have seen before people kind of planting asparagus crowns like each one's like an octopus with the roots all spread out around it. It's not necessary to do that, and that's going to take a lot more time. So basically, we're doing head to toe planting about 12 inches apart. When you get your crowns, open up the box, look at the crowns, cut into a few roots on a few of the crowns, and check for disease. What you want to see, what a healthy crown looks like, is bright white storage roots, and they're nice and firm. If they're kind of wrinkly and dull, and you see a dull brown color inside of the roots, that may indicate that those crowns have a fusarium infection. And it could also mean, however, that a few of those roots have just dried up. So if you cut into a bunch of roots and you see a dull brown color, it's a really good idea to get a second opinion on that. You can send it into the plant disease clinic at U of M, or you can send it into, University of Wisconsin if you'd rather, or Iowa State University. But send that into a plant disease clinic to see if it is fusarium. If it is a fusarium infection, that is a fungal disease that is very, very, very hard to get rid of once it gets into your soil. And so this is something it's really important to keep that out of the field. But a lot of the nurseries that you all have been buying from are reputable nurseries that are going to be making sure that they don't have infected crowns. They put a lot of effort into producing healthy crowns. So hopefully you won't find any fusarium infection on your crowns. Digging the furrows, this is something that can be done with, this is a piece of equipment that someone custom built in northern Minnesota. It can be done with something like this, or just a simple shovel, whatever equipment you have, a single plow, something that can be just used basically to make these furrows. You want the furrows to be somewhere between 8 and 12 inches deep, and you actually plant the crowns in the bottoms of the furrows and then gradually fill them in over the season. So here in this photo, you can kind of see 8 to 12 inches from the level of the soil, and then it gets kind of mounded up in between your rows. The rows can be anywhere between, I would say, 3 and 5 foot row spacing. I know farmers who are growing at 5 foot row spacing. I know farmers who are growing at 3. At Hoffa, they use 3 foot spacing because that's what works with their equipment. Paul chose his spacing based on what works with his equipment, with his mower. Somebody might choose a further away spacing because they have a big mower or something they need to get between the rows. If you put them at 3-foot spacing, those rows are going to grow into each other, and you are going to end up not having much walking space at all between the rows because the asparagus spears really spread out. When deciding on depth, I said anywhere between about 8 and 12 inches, and Paul can say what he did too. If you plant at shallower depths, there's a chance that you're going to get thinner spears, and they may be more susceptible to frost as well, but you will probably have an earlier harvest. This is based on, asparagus depth studies over the years. If you have sandier soil, you can do a deeper depth because there's less hard soil for those spears to fight with when they're coming up in the spring. But if you have a really heavy clay soil, you may decide to go at a shallower depth, more like 8 inches rather than 12, because you don't want that asparagus to have to fight through too much clay in order to emerge in the spring. Paul, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, we used a trencher similar to what's seen in the picture there, just a homemade trench, and there may have been inconsistencies in depth on that. We've got a couple spots in our patches where there's 6 to 8 feet with no asparagus growing, and I always questioned whether or not that was a spot where the trencher came out of the ground a little bit. We planted too shallow. Perhaps there was existing hard pan there. We're Fayette silt loam here, so we're shallow to clay, so we can get into spots where there's an issue like that. At one time, my father planted a patch that was 16 to 18 inches deep, and one plant came up. So in our soil, that will not work. Like you said, Annie, it might work in sandier soil, but you want to be pretty accurate, I think. I think accuracy is pretty important on planting depth for the 12 inches.
Okay. Step 2, planting the crowns. This is similar to the photo I showed before. So you're looking at 12-inch spacing. What's handy about the crowns that you receive is that a lot of them are about a foot long. So you can just plant them head to toe. When I say head, I mean these little buds here. This is what the spears are going to emerge from. So you should have spears emerging roughly every 12 inches or so. All right, so if you do plant closer, what generally happens is that you're going to be getting smaller spears, especially over time, because like I said before, those asparagus plants basically grow into each other over time. So if you have a temptation to plant closer, I would encourage you not to do that. So often people will sprinkle phosphorus about maybe 2/3 of the year's total in the trench with the asparagus. This is a common recommendation. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you have to do, but Paul, didn't you say that you did incorporate some phosphorus into the trench when you planted?
Right, and we did 100% of the recommendation of the pounds of phosphate in the trench. It's because I hadn't done any preconditioning of the soil, and I don't, it seemed okay, but the phosphorus isn't going to move around like nitrogen. So, and there are organic forms of pelletized phosphate too. Analysis is usually a lot lower because it's pelletized composted chicken litter usually. So.
Yeah. And then, so the next step after you put those you put those crowns in the ground is to backfill a little bit into your trench. Don't let the spears sit there too long before you backfill because you don't want them to dry out. So maybe you have somebody following behind the person planting to help fill in those trenches. So maybe you do it with 2 people. But you want to backfill about 2 inches of soil over those crowns. You definitely don't want to be able to see the crowns peeking out of the soil at all. And so then this helps them grow. Then this is what the spears originally start emerging from. And then gradually throughout the season, you complete that backfill, you put the rest of the soil back in. Now, this is something that Paul and I have had conversations about, wondering what is the best way to really do this? Because, the old school recommendation is you go back in and continue backfilling your trench about 3 to 4 times over the season. And so each time you would just be putting a little bit of that soil back into your trench. But our question is, do you really need to go in that many times and gradually do that? And is that realistic? Because a couple of things happen. One is that when it rains, the rain is going to push some of that soil into your trench naturally anyway. So you may go out mid-season to backfill and you find that all your soil is already in your trench already. The second thing is something that happens is that if your soil gets really hard from sitting out above the level of the soil, you know, your backfill soil, and if you try to use a tractor to put that on your spears, it can break a lot of spears. So this photo, I know it's a little hard to see on the right, but this is a couple of broken spears that resulted from trying to backfill those trenches. So we've wondered, do you really need to go in gradually that many times, or could you just go in maybe twice? One time you backfill with the soil that's on the left, the second time you backfill with the soil that's on the right. So it might just depend a lot on the situation at your farm, but I'm sort of beginning to think that maybe you can just backfill twice and make sure you're doing that once the spears are a little bit longer than 5 inches, so that you have less of a risk of breaking them. But basically, once the furrow is full, the soil should be level throughout your entire field. Your asparagus should not be on a mound. It should not be in a trench. It should just be level with the soil around it. All right, so in-season maintenance for the first year, irrigation in Minnesota, especially with how we've been trending towards wetter summers, it's typically only recommended in the first year unless you are growing on a very sandy soil. But if you're growing on a very sandy soil, not using irrigation, especially in the first year, can really stunt your yield. But most asparagus farms in Minnesota are not using irrigation except for the first year, and some of them are not even using it in the first year, depending on how much rain we're getting. For weeds are really challenging in organic asparagus. Hand pulling in the rows, unfortunately, is often necessary. It's just you're not cultivating in those asparagus rows, especially not right next to the spears that are coming up. So really, one of your only other options is hand pulling. Cultivation between the rows is definitely an option. Flaming is an option as well. And then look at your soil fertility. You may need to fertilize again based on your soil tests and the knowledge of the soil on your farm. Just keep in mind that next year's crop is determined by the previous year's plant health. This goes not just for new asparagus stands, but older asparagus stands as well. So make sure you really are taking care of it. A field like this, there's a lot of thistles coming up. This is a common problem in perennial crops. These thistles are going to be competing a lot with that asparagus. And so Paul and I, who's pictured here, we had, a conversation about what is the best way to deal with these thistles. We don't have time to get into that, but Natalie and I have both done a couple of presentations at the Minnesota Organic Conference on how to deal with thistles. After harvest, so this is not for your first year, but in your mature years when you're actually getting a crop. After harvest, typically we will harvest all of the remaining spears once growth has significantly slowed down. So at least by July 1st, typically that end date may vary a little bit depending on where you are in the state and what your season has been like. Fertilize if needed at the end of the season, and a lot of people will actually incorporate this, and so they'll do a little bit of shallow cultivation after all of those spears have been harvested in order to incorporate some fertilizer. And then just let those ferns grow out. So, this is July, those ferns are growing pretty big, and that allows your plant to take up carbon and nutrients and then put them back into the roots for the following year. So it's important to let those ferns grow. In the late fall is one time that we recommend removing those ferns after they're completely dormant like you see here. But in Minnesota, farmers like Paul have been finding that that's not really feasible because they don't go dormant by the time we have a lot of snow on the ground. The advantage of removing them in the fall, if you can, is that this is better for controlling asparagus beetle. Asparagus beetle is a pest that causes a lot of damage to your spears, makes them unmarketable, makes them kind of curve like a cane. And they overwinter in your ferns. So if you can get them out in the fall, you get rid of that overwintering spot for asparagus beetle. If you have to wait until the spring, one option to get rid of the asparagus beetle is to burn those spears. Burn those ferns. If not, if you can't burn, just make sure you're really getting those out of the field because you're then removing the asparagus beetles as well. Here are some considerations for organic and sustainability or sustainable production of asparagus. The first one is non-chemical weed management. As I said before, this just introduces a lot of labor for taking care of asparagus, specifically in the rows. Between the rows, there are a lot of options on how you can manage weeds, and we'll go into a couple of those. Organic soil amendments, we kind of talked about this. Think about cover cropping. So we'll go into that in a couple slides. Reducing tillage, asparagus is a great crop for reducing tillage. There isn't a whole lot of need for tillage in asparagus. And in the first year, really make sure you are keeping up on weed management and nutrition, even though weed management is very labor intensive. Okay, so should asparagus be tilled? There's actually been a lot of research on this, not recently, but 20 or 30 years ago. Here's why some farmers will till in the spring or after harvest in asparagus. Before emergence in the spring, some farmers want to incorporate fertilizer, like granulated fertilizer, and they feel that cultivation is the only way they can really do this. After harvest, some people will cultivate as well. This has to be a really, really shallow cultivation because there's a high risk that you could damage the spears anytime you cultivate. It also kills weeds after the harvest season if those weeds are small, but it will stimulate thistle growth if you're only tilling once per year. So research studying no-till asparagus has found that in no-till, the root systems are denser and healthier. That's what one study found. Another study found that there was better crown, fern, and bud growth when not tilling compared to when spring tillage occurred. And this was because of that high risk of damaging those crowns and spears during tillage. There were more perennial weeds possibly, and more creep of the cover crop into rows. So this is what an inter-row cover crop can look like. This is Paul's farm, so he'll talk more about it. But basically, this is a really good opportunity for introducing cover crops to your farm. So a lot of the time, this is a perennial cover crop, such as a fescue, a bluegrass, or a clover, or maybe a mix that is planted in between the rows. One of the really great things that this accomplishes for us is it makes it much easier to travel through the asparagus patch during wet conditions, like we often have in the spring. If you always cultivate between your rows and leave those bare, can you imagine trying to walk out in the spring on that soil? Every year, if we're getting a lot of rain, you're just kind of gonna fall right in if it's being cultivated every year. So planting a perennial cover crop between there is a good option to help with that. It also reduces weed growth between rows because you've got that nice thatch and provides a nice pollinator habitat as well. So with inter-row cover crops, this is something that you could establish your first year. You could be establishing it now. You could be establishing it in the summer, just depending on what sort of cover crop you want to plant. It's going to depend a lot on the specific species. This can be maintained with regular mowing, so Paul has to have his rows wide enough to get through there with a mower. And consider how the cover crop might creep into the rows. So especially if you're planting a perennial cover crop for new asparagus, you really want to think about this. For some farmers who have perennial cover crops, they say, I let my cover crop creep into the row and my yields are still great. And that's good. So this is something that depends farm by farm, but there was a study that did show that inter-row cover crops encroaching into the asparagus reduced yield by 25 to 50%. And that was a clover and a ryegrass cover. So this is something that you really want to think about. If you're on a lower vigor site, you might have more of a yield reduction effect by letting your cover crop creep into the rows. Some of the options for perennials would be fescues, bluegrass, Dutch white clover. The advantages of these are they're lower maintenance. Again, they protect soil from foot traffic. They are slower to establish and they can creep into the rows. One idea, which, disclaimer, I don't know anyone doing this, it's just an idea, just a creative idea, is you might consider planting annual cover crops between your rows. This is something that you could consider planting in the fall, and you could either plant something that dies over the winter or overwinters, and then you would mow it down in the spring, but this would also create a mulch between your rows that could be maintained through the harvest season for your asparagus. So it's still creating a mulch that you can use to walk over, but you would have to, of course, replant it every year. So it's just an idea to think about. I don't know anybody doing that. So this picture on the left is from Paul's farm, and you can see how the cover crops and some weeds have gotten into the rows, and I'll have Paul comment on how that worked out or how that works out for him. In the middle, this is from the Student Organic Farm at the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus. You can see some buckwheat and some sorghum Sudan grass. Sorghum Sudan grass is typically going to be too tall to use between your asparagus. I think it would compete too much with those ferns that are coming up after harvest. This picture on the right, I know that that's not asparagus. It's just a really nice, neat looking example of an inter-row cover crop in vegetables. There's a lot more cover crop information on the University of Minnesota website. There's good information on there for organic growers too, specifically. So I would encourage you to check this out. There's a ton of information on there. Paul, do you want to comment on your experience using perennial cover crops in your stand?
Yeah, on ours, like I said earlier, we initially just made the trenches right into established hay ground, and that was just a bad idea. Alfalfa is not it's something that you can mow easily with a lawnmower. It's got a deep tap root. It's probably stealing nutrients, water, whatever. The second half, the last 5,000 we planted, we did plant kind of a grass cover over there, and then we were getting so many weeds in row. We did the shallow tilling right over the row, and then tried to establish kind of a low grow grass right in there, which grew great. And then winter killed the next year, and that was that earlier picture that showed all the dandelions. Well, this one, the picture here shows dandelions too, growing in row. And I guess we've had really good yields lately. It's only anecdotal that I say that our yields are fine with weeds and stuff working their way into there. I don't, we haven't done any trials or anything, but it's one of the things we kind of accept with organic management, is that you're going to have some weeds, and the weeds are going to creep into the row. I think, like Annie stressed, initial weed control during the first year, 2 years, let those crowns establish. And then the competition isn't that big of a deal, because you've got a good tap root, you've got a good root system established. There again, those shallow roots are the feeder roots. So if it's a dry year and you have grass and a lot of weeds above it, you're going to probably starve that plant a little bit for moisture. Hasn't been an issue in the last few years, but it can be. And it really depends on your soil type too. Like I said, we're Fayette silt loam at my place. 12 inches down, you run into solid clay. That's a good moisture source in a drought year. So consider that if you're on sandier soil, that could be an issue.
All right. So let's leave the last 15 minutes for Q&A. And so I'm going to leave this mostly to Paul, but I might chime in if people have specific questions for me. So here are some of the topics that we often cover during this Q&A. If you have questions, please type them into the chat box, which is either at the top or the bottom of your screen. All right.
Say, Annie?
Yep.
Hey, I'm just following along on my Google Drive because Zoom is not working on my computer. So if you can read me any questions that you want me to address, that'd be great.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, nobody's typed in a question yet. So how about you start by talking about harvesting? How do you harvest, and what do you do with the spears when you harvest them?
You bet. So one of the things, once let's talk mature crop, say 3 years down the road after planting, we'll go out there and like this year, I'm assuming we're going to see asparagus either by the end of this week or the following week. So you're looking at probably the 3rd, 4th week of April. You want to have, hopefully it's coming by May, because that's when most of our farmers markets start. If you get it by Mother's Day, that's a jackpot. Because everybody wants asparagus. But so we go out there and we hand snap our asparagus. A lot of people cut it. It just depends on your presentation, but we're organic and we want to have hand snapped, hand cleaned, hand bundled asparagus. We bring it in, we give it, try and get it out of the sun as quickly as you can. Bring it in, give it kind of a cold water bath, and then we bundle. Sometimes we sort by diameter. We've got some customers that like skinny asparagus, some that like fat. So we try and bundle a little bit according to diameter. The restaurants that work with us, they've gone to the really fat asparagus because now they know that a fresh asparagus of high quality is better if it's larger in diameter than the thinner in diameter. We bundle them up in 1 pound bundles. And then like Annie said, it's about $5 a pound is an average price around Minnesota. And then we stand them in boxes. I put a little water in the bottom of my box. We use a box liner and stand them in that water. And in 7 days, you really won't even be able to tell that they haven't been just picked. They'll last 7 days really good in refrigeration, and probably 10 to 14 days. But if you get stuck with asparagus that long, you may have to check the bottoms if you're standing them in water. If you're not standing them in water, then you'll probably wind up with some dry ends on them there. And I don't know, anything else, Annie?
I think that's it on that. We got a few really good questions coming in. So the first one that came in is, any insights into mulching with straw or wood chips, either in the walking path or on top of the rows?
We mulched the first asparagus we planted. We took an old round bale, and I don't remember if it was hay or straw. I think it was actually straw, and mulched it over there over the rows. And the following years, we had a slug infestation in that mulch that we almost couldn't get rid of. And once we got all the mulch off, that was the housing all the slugs, then they moved underneath dandelions and thistles and still stayed there. And the slugs were a bear to get out of there. I wound up having to flame that field to burn off any of those perennials. I wouldn't recommend mulch. I do like Annie's idea of perhaps using annual cover crop in between the rows to be as a mulch the following year. In a wet spring, I don't know, it might only be a week or two and you might have stomped through that last year's mulch, but that'd be something. But I guess I wouldn't recommend that. There isn't really any need for mulching.
I've also noticed that one farm I worked with last year who was mulching, they didn't take their mulch off in time in the spring, and so the spears started coming up, and if that happens, the spears come up white if they're covered in mulch. So if you do want to use some sort of mulch, you got to make sure it's off of there before the start of the season. The next question was to check for fusarium, which is that disease that you check your crowns for. Do you recommend checking every crown and then checking every root on that crown? No, I don't. You can't do that because then you'd be cutting into all of your roots. So all you need to do is take some samples. So you could randomly stick your hand, in your box of crowns and pick up maybe 1 crown from each box or 1 crown from each bundle, depending on how many crowns you're planting. You just want a few subsamples. And then from that crown that you take to test, just cut into maybe 2 roots from that crown. You don't want to do too many or you're going to damage your crowns. The next one, I'll take this one too because it's about soil testing. Recommendation for soil test depth. Go about 8 inches into the soil, somewhere between 6 to 8 inches. And when you take a soil sample, Natalie and I have both done videos on this, so you can find them on the University of Minnesota Small Farms YouTube channel. When you take these samples, you want to take subsamples from throughout your field, mix those together in a bucket really well, and then take about a pint of that to send to the lab. So yeah, 6 to 8 inches is what you want to go to. Any beneficial relationship with mycorrhizal fungi? I can talk generally about mycorrhizal fungi, which is that it helps process nutrients and get those to the plants. But I don't know if there's any research on mycorrhizal fungi in asparagus specifically.
I think, Annie, I think that the benefit of mycorrhizal fungi is in every plant, every organism that grows above the ground. Anything you can do to maintain mycorrhizal fungi populations in your soil will be beneficial. Mm-hmm. There's nothing about mycorrhizal fungi that will be detrimental to your plants.
Yep, absolutely. And I feel like in a no-till situation, you're promoting mycorrhizal fungi because you're promoting the microbial communities in the soil. So, is anyone doing livestock integration into asparagus? Do you want to take this one, Paul?
You bet. I've talked to some people who come out with chickens after harvest, and they'll just be targeting the asparagus beetle. And chickens will do a good job of harvesting tender cover crops too, or grasses. Otherwise, typically, you try to keep livestock out of there, just because when you harvest the product, it's basically in contact with the soil, and any chance of manures that may harbor E. coli would be something we'd try to avoid. Early on, I did put some horse manure right down the row. I think it was the second year establishment in mine. And 2 years later, I could still see that dried horse manure in the row, and I thought that was an error in judgment there. So I know chicken manure is a little more soluble, but still, it's something we just try to avoid when you're harvesting produce that's in contact with the soil.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Wow, we got through a lot of questions in 5 minutes just now.
Hey, if not, I do have one more thing I wanted to add, and it was with our discussion on filling in the trench. So Terry Ninich, who is a seasoned grower from northern Minnesota, has done, I don't know if he has any data on it, but more of an anecdotal research that with Millennium, the variety Millennium, he has been able to fill the trench in one pass, and he felt there was no detrimental issue with the Millennium coming through that. He said the open pollinated varieties like the Purple Passion, the older ones, Mary Washington, if anybody bought those to plant. Now, I did buy some Purple Passion this year, so I'm going to test this theory. He said you better plan on multiple fillings. He said jerseys in the right year, you can get away with it with filling that trench in one pass. Annie, do you remember at Hoffa, the grower who filled her trench in one pass, did she have Jersey variety?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and that was the best looking stand I saw all last year. So I mean, there again, you're in a sandier soil there. Maybe it's not so much of an issue as in, say, a silt loam or clay loam.
Somebody asked, can you share more about pests and diseases to look out for? So we have a fact sheet on that we made, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so that I can bring that up to show, and while Paul talks about other stuff. Paul, do you want to talk about kind of your marketing strategy? That's something that we haven't hit on yet.
Yeah, we're organic down here, so I mean, a little bit of our organic strategy is that we touch every spear by hand, and it's organic production. We do not cut them all to cut the spears to be a uniform length. There's a little bit that a little bit of marketing strategy that goes into that, because I mean, when people see something, just basically wild harvested, cleaned up and bundled together, it does promote kind of an organic feel to the product. The restaurants, they could care less. They're going to cut them to whatever length fits on their plates, and they typically don't waste anything they cut off. When we hand snap an asparagus, when you bend an asparagus spear, I mean, most of you are probably familiar with this, but when you bend an asparagus spear, it snaps at the point where everything is edible in that spear. So when we sell a pound of asparagus, it's a pound of edible asparagus. If you go through and you cut your asparagus and you cut, say, 2 inches of woody asparagus at the bottom, people are going to have to trim that off anyway. So I really like the hand snapping. That's probably our biggest marketing point. When someone buys a pound of asparagus from me for $5, or a pound of asparagus from somebody who cut it off at ground level for $5, they're probably getting about an additional dollar's worth of asparagus from me, because everything is edible. So, and like I said, restaurants prefer that. That's not to say that all restaurants want that. There again, you might see the need to bundle some asparagus by diameter size, those types of things. One of the other things you want to consider is that when the asparagus starts to open up on top, you really want a tight top to the asparagus. When it starts to open up and show seeds, that's not a good look. It means that that top is not as delicate once it's cooked. And as the season progresses, you're going to see that happen more and more early. Early on in the season, 2 weeks into your season, you can probably have an 18-inch tall spear without the top opening. But 6 weeks into it, you're going to be struggling to get that 10-inch spear where you can snap off a nice 8-incher. And then 8 weeks in, you're going to know when you need to quit, because the heads are going to open up. Some of them will open up 6 inches tall. Your asparagus will just start to look weird. And, it'll have kind of knotty looking. It'll grow like a branch. It won't be smooth. And that's when it's getting really stressed. So you need to quit picking at that point.
All right. Thanks. So I brought up our fact sheet that we released as part of this project. I titled it "What's Wrong with My Plant? Asparagus," because we have a lot of "What's Wrong with My Plant" fact sheets. So on this are some of the more common disease and insect problems that asparagus can get. How I've organized it is with a symptom, because you're going to go out to your field and you're going to see something wrong with your asparagus, and you're not going to go, oh, that's Phytophthora. You're going to go, I have a rotting crooked spear. What could this be? So with a rotting or crooked spear, like you see here, that's something that can cause that as Phytophthora crown and spear rot. So this is something that often happens in wetter environments. So site selection is key. Avoiding overwatering is key, but it's something that it's possible you might see in a really, really wet season. This is another reason why buying from a reputable supplier is important, because they can ensure disease-free, or they can try to ensure disease-free transplants as much as possible. This picture here, this crooked spear that's otherwise pretty healthy, this is what asparagus beetle does. So this is something where I think it would be more difficult to market this, but it's still perfectly edible. So again, the larvae, they overwinter in the ferns, and so removing ferns in the late fall instead of the spring is a way to get rid of these if it's possible for you to do that. So this is called purple spot, this fungal disease here, and it's small purple sunken ovals. See, cytospora leaf spot, another fungal disease you'll often see on the ferns if they start yellowing before the end of the season. Asparagus rust is when we see really, really commonly. I'm just going through these quickly because you can read more about them, and I want to get to the other questions. Fern yellowing, this is kind of what fusarium looks like as well. So Teresa, is this fact sheet available on the asparagus part of the SFA website, or can we get this to everybody?
It is, and the fact sheet on planting my asparagus is also there, along with the original asparagus document from Extension. And we can certainly, after this, we'll be sending out an evaluation, and we'll include links to this and to the other fact sheet.
Okay, great. And then maybe this is the last question because it's 10:03, but Britt asked, in addition to pests, do deer like asparagus? Paul, do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, not that I've seen an issue, but I say that about garlic too. I grow an acre of garlic right alongside an acre of asparagus, and people have sent me pictures all the time where deer nip their young garlic off tight. So, I mean, I think it mainly is a pressure issue with deer. If you've got a nice young succulent asparagus, a deer might come in there and chomp it down. But we live right next to a state park. I have deer passing around the property all the time. They do not usually eat. One of the things that is a little more concerning is when you come out there and you find a big pile of deer crap right in the middle of a row of asparagus. And if you guys have taken FSMA training, you know that you kind of need to address that. Get it out of there, quarantine that area, because it's fresh manure and it's right on a ground contact produce. So I'd be more concerned with the defecation of the animal than any predation of the deer.
Okay, thanks. All right, what do you think, Teresa? Is there more time, or do we need to wrap up?
I think if people have any final parting questions, I had one quick question for the group that I'm hoping folks can respond to verbally. Any final questions? All righty. Well, we are planning some additional webinars for constituencies that we had otherwise decided to that we were going to be doing a face-to-face on-site field day. And it is our hope that COVID-19 notwithstanding, that we will be able to do a field day and planting demonstrations. So I just want to let you know that we'll notify you of any of those developments. Are there other training materials that you would like to help you succeed in growing and marketing asparagus? And know that in working with RSDP, we're actually just starting to focus on the marketing side. So I would think it would be a couple, 3 months before we'd have good marketing information to supplement what Paul has discussed. But we'll for sure be doing a publication, and I'm interested in us doing a webinar or some type of remote learning. And Melissa said, I think creative weed pressure solutions would be great. And I will certainly make a note of that.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we can work more on.
Yeah. The other thing I'm wondering, are there people on this call? In fact, I know Jim and Audra are on the call, Jim and Audra Chamberlain, who have grown asparagus and who have anything they wish to share. Boy, a quiet group. I know you're not really quiet. I know some of the folks on this call.
Do you want them to, do you want to unmute, or do you want people to type into the chat box?
I can unmute everybody if that makes it easier for folks. So let me do that. Oh, that might not be a good decision. You're all unmuted now, so.
Uh-oh.
Except for Leo. I thought I heard Leo.
So this is Jim. Our asparagus patch is probably 15 years old. We put in, I think it was 200 or 250 crowns a long time ago. I don't remember how long it was. But we've been trying to get chickens on there after we're done harvesting in July every couple of years or so, and that's really seemed to help that patch out a lot. So we're looking forward to doing that on a bigger scale. See how that works. We did experiment a little bit last fall with letting some goats in on our patch after the crown started to brown up, or after the ferns started to brown up and die off for the year, go dormant. Other than that, we haven't really done anything for fertility in 15 years.
How long did you leave the chickens on there, Jim?
We let them build a pretty good, well, look, we let them pack down all the weeds. If the spheres get up high enough, if you get some of the ferns to get, up 2-3 feet at least, and then 3 or 4 for each crown, so they get well established, and then let the chickens in. We let them trample it pretty well. We mow between the rows, and then it's not too tall when the chickens, during harvest we mow between the rows. And then when we put the chickens in, it's not real tall, and they seem to trample everything down. We leave it there till there's a fairly good manure pack, I guess.
Yeah, I was mainly concerned about the manure, but chicken manure is pretty soluble, and as long as it's not on there too thick where it would last until the following year and be an issue, you know, that might be a good way of handling it.
Yeah, we don't see it there the next year. It's pretty much gone by spring.
Okay, good.
The manure.
Somebody asked, how often do you need to add new crowns to keep a continual patch? You should only have to add new crowns if you have plants die. But even if you have a few plants here and there dying, the other plants around them are going to fill in that space. So I would say, you know, if you get to a situation where you've got 5 feet down your row that got, you know, the crowns died or it got missed for some reason, then you might want to, but if it's just one crown here and there, you know, I feel like that's going to fill in. You could replace it if you want, but it's probably going to fill in the space on its own. So adding new crowns should not be a regular thing that you need to do in order to keep a continual patch.
I also want to encourage everybody who plans on planting this year to get your crowns ordered if you haven't. It's getting pretty late. I have heard that some places like, I guess, I don't know if it's Rutgers, that they are out of Millennium. But if you have not gotten your crowns, do it right away. Get it done today because supplies are dwindling.
So Detroit Lakes, Ag Resources in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota is one place you can get crowns, and you know, it's a family business, and so you just call them and you say, this is a situation, I need to get crowns. They'll do whatever they can to help you. So you might consider going there, or Norse is one of the bigger companies too, so they might have a better chance of still having some supply, but it is pretty late.
And Dave Berkey, the proprietor at Ag up in Detroit Lakes, knows about our asparagus project. So he has been helping some folks. Mostly he tells people to go on the website that, what's the company? Annie, I'm sorry, I'm spacing it.
What company? The one that he sources his crowns from? Norse. Yeah. Nourse. So what do you mean? He's directing people there, or he's telling people to just go to their website to shop?
To go to their website to shop.
Okay, so you can get a lot of information about what varieties are out there that he can sell you, because Ag Resource sources their crowns from Norse, basically.
Thanks, Melissa. She put it in the chat room there.
Thanks.
Any other questions or final comments? So you can expect a follow-up that will include just an evaluation and the links to the publications that we have. I also will put Annie and Paul's emails so that you can contact them. Oh, Melissa asked, can you transplant asparagus?
It's really difficult to transplant mature asparagus because the crowns from the different plants really intertwine with each other. So if you really want to transplant like a few asparagus plants, it's doable, but it's going to be really hard. And so a lot of people who try doing that end up not doing it and just buying new crowns.
All right, well, let's wrap it up. I really want to thank Annie and Paul and thank Connie for setting this up. And I really appreciate everybody's participation. And just have a good day.